I would call it a conspiracy, a global conspiracy. Here is a way to permissibly hate Jews by saying it's justified by any means necessary, right? So you hear this things that are surreal. Any means necessary means torching babies. Any means necessary means gang raping teenage girls who were at a concert. Any means necessary means after you finished raping them, mutilating their genitals. Any means necessary means killing people in front of their children and other family members. Any means necessary is beheadings. This is utter barbarism. How is it possible that something like this can be treated as justified?
Welcome to the Viktor Frankl Podcast. I'm Lori Fein, here with Rabbi Daniel Schonbuch. We're excited to bring you today Professor Thane Rosenbaum, who is the Distinguished University Professor at Torah University, the head of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society, and the legal analyst for CBS News Radio. Thane is the author of numerous books, including his most recent, Beyond Proportionality, an examination of the Gaza war and more broadly the situation of a just nation attempting to follow the laws of war, engaged with a terrorist entity that pays no mind to those laws. Thane, thank you so much for coming on and welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Lori. It's great to be here with you and the rabbi.
Excellent. So I wanted to start off talking about why you decided to write this book, and is it something that you've been working on many years or mulling over for ages, or is it something that you feel like the new war has brought new insight to?
So it's a good question. It really started for me over 10 years ago, at the last Gaza war. I was brought into a global conversation in a very negative light. I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal in the 2014 war that Israel fought against Hamas after 10,000 rockets had been fired against Israel, and Israel finally decided to do something about it. And all of a sudden, we started to hear words of innocent civilians. And I've been a law professor for over 30 years, specializing in a number of areas dealing with constitutional law and human rights. And I've also written a lot about genocide and the Holocaust and Holocaust memory. And I thought, whoa, this is the very first time we started hearing words not quite like we are today about genocide. We were hearing words like ethnic cleansing. And I heard about innocent civilians. And I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal in which I said, wait a minute, I'm not sure the word innocent applies here. I said, civilians are civilians, of course. But the Geneva Conventions were never written with Gazans in mind. If the Geneva Convention, the drafters in 1947 had known about Gazans, they would have made different new provisions to say, well, not all civilians are innocent. Some of them are complicit. They aid and abet. They join the fight in a multiplicity of ways. You can join a war without carrying a machine gun. There are many ways to do it. You become complicit. Once you're involved in the war and essentially bought in, you lose that civilian status. And that's number one. Number two, the whole notion of human shields, in which Gazan civilians overwhelmingly were not leaving the buildings that Israel was telegraphing to them, saying, tomorrow we will be conducting an operation in your building. Please leave. And they would make this message through text messages, voicemails. They would send flyers. They would send down from helicopters speakers that spoke in Arabic. Your building is scheduled for an operation tomorrow. Please evacuate. Go to corridor A or B or some other humanitarian zone. They weren't leaving. And so I said, well, the Geneva Conventions never anticipated anything like this. So I wrote an op-ed in which I talked about this, saying, this is a civilian death strategy that Hamas has perpetrated with the complicity of civilians. And Israel needs to be understood that they're fighting a war, an asymmetric war, not a conventional war, an asymmetric war in a city with civilians that are participating in this way. And of course, the minute the op-ed came out, I was the subject of a number of attacks everywhere on cable television, as if I was saying it's okay to kill Palestinian children. And in fact, in the essay, I said, children are essentially the victims of the choices that their parents make. Children are always innocent. But I also pointed out something that we still don't talk about, which is a number of people that are called children are 14-year-olds carrying machine guns. And I said, not in that essay, but I've written since, I know of no moral principle, maybe the rabbi does, but I know of no moral principle where a 14-year-old carrying a machine gun has more value than an 18-year-old Israeli carrying a machine gun. And so the press presents this as children being killed, and there are teenage fighters who fight for Hamas and Islamic Jihad who are clearly in the fight, and they're not being presented that way. So for the love of God, can we at least define who we're fighting? Because we're only talking about, you know, the image of little children or babies, when in fact that's not what this is about. This is about something else. So that I became part of a sensational, you know, attack against anyone defending Israel 10 years ago, so that when the third war arose, an editor reached out to me and said, look, I know about what happened with your last essay, you know, in the Wall Street Journal 2014. I think this is going to happen again. And I said, of course it's going to happen again. I mean, this is the way Hamas fights its wars. So then I said, you know, maybe what we should do is a book that actually goes through military doctrine, the laws of the manual of the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict, the rules of engagement, the conventions on the punishment and prevention of genocide, the Geneva Conventions and the protocols that were written in 1977 as additions. Let's go through the international law and take a look at what international law says in the context of the way Israel is fighting this war, which is a just war, and they're fighting it justly. Everyone is screaming words like violation of international law, and no one knows what that means. And I said, well, let me write a book that says, stop saying things that you don't understand. I'll explain it to you, then you can judge for yourself what Israel has done. But stop saying things that you don't understand. And most people that don't understand that people who claim to be lawyers on international law, it's a very, very small niche. It's almost an insignificant number of people who practice international law. And most of them, frankly, are Jew haters. So of course you're going to have their major anti-Semites. They all work with NGOs, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. George Clooney's wife, she's a first-class Jew hater and has been so her entire career. That's the best thing you could say about her.
So it sounds like if somebody tells you they're an international lawyer, be aware of them, correct?
That's right. I'm saying if someone shows you a card and says international lawyer, you should say, you know, Thane Rosenbaum said, by definition, you're an anti-Semite. Let's see.
You know, as a lawyer myself and with friends who practice in this area who are very pro-Israel, I don't want to condemn everyone.
Well, I will.
For sure.
I'm comfortable with that.
And I also feel, out of respect for you, Thane, and admiration for the book that you've written, I would like to just say that your description of it made it seem very dry, but I would love for people who are listening to understand that it is anything but. It is, you know, for a book that is a legal subject, which many people would not be able to handle this material, you have brought it down to a level that, first of all, any type of audience could not only understand, but I think really enjoy. One of the things that I really admire about you is your ability to merge popular culture, social issues, as well as the legal issues themselves.
You know, there are movies in this book. I discuss Lawrence of Arabia and Exodus and Ben-Hur and the patriot. There's actual culture
Right.
in this book, and it's filled with anecdotes and stories of things that have actually happened in that region. So I appreciate you understanding that this is not an academic treatise. All of my nonfiction books are written for people. They're not written for academics. And by the way, academics fall into the category I said before about international lawyers. The vast majority of academics have very strong anti-Israel opinions. And so I wasn't writing for them. I already know who they are. I'm writing for people that are genuinely confused, especially if they want to be pro-Israel, but all they hear is the word genocide, and they want to feel that they're a good person, and they don't want to feel that they support genocide. And I'm saying, it's okay. Let me explain this to you. And Lori is right. I'm a novelist, and I tell this nonfiction story as a storyteller and not as an academic.
It really seems to be a war on words right now.
Yes.
I've watched you in some of your interviews. You're quite remarkable. I haven't heard anybody like you speak with such clarity and veracity on these issues.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And really confronting terms like genocide and ethnic cleansing. It all sounds so ridiculous but what's the essence, Thane? What is the essence of this? It seems to be that many people in the West portray support for Hamas's moral courage while condemning Israel's right to self-defense. What do you believe is the essence of this?
Rabbi, it can only be anti-Semitism. This war has provided a license to hate Jews and treat it as a matter of justice. That hating Jews and calling for the death of Jews is a call to social activism. I know that sounds insane. Any rabbi should say that's madness. What do you mean? There is social justice in the killing of Jews, but this was a trick, a magic trick. I would call it a conspiracy, a global conspiracy. Here is a way to permissibly hate Jews by saying it's justified by any means necessary, right? So you hear things that are surreal. Any means necessary means torching babies. Any means necessary means gang raping teenage girls who were at a concert. Any means necessary means after you finished raping them, mutilating their genitals. Any means necessary means killing people in front of their children and other family members. Any means necessary is beheadings. This is utter barbarism. How is it possible that something like this can be treated as justified? Now, again, some things happened very early that tipped you off to what was going on. The tearing down of the posters. Why? Well, we're not allowed to show sympathy to Jews. And I don't like these posters. They have to come down. They have to come down because it sends the wrong message. The wrong message is that these Jews have stolen land from Arabs and have killed Arabs, and they deserve none of our sympathies. And so that's why even when we saw video coverage that was filmed by the Gazans, we were told it was fake, right? Feminists in the United States and with the United Nations refused in the era of Me Too, where we were told to believe survivors, which as a law professor, I can tell you is problematic because we live in a society that says you're innocent until proven guilty. So when somebody says believe survivors, what they're really saying to you is ignore the law. You're not innocent until proven guilty. If the survivor says you did it, you did it. But that's what we saw in the Me Too era, except Rabbi and Lori, except when it came to Jewish Israelis. Then you don't believe survivors. They made it up. The IDF did it. It's all manufactured. It never took place. So the speed with which we were trying to erase the crime or to minimize the crime or to justify the crime or to trivialize the crime was extraordinary. 33 student groups at Harvard on October 8th, 2023, the next day, wrote a joint letter blaming the attack on Israel, as if to say this was the very beginnings of what I would call a global conspiracy, to say we have barbarism, but we're going to turn it on its head and say barbarism is really justice, moral justice. This is what is ultimately deserved. And I've always said, and I say this in the book, what could Israel have possibly have ever done to justify October 7th? Right? Let's just say what could they have possibly done to justify mass rapes? There were the raping of corpses, beheadings of people, torching. So I don't understand it, Rabbi. All I could tell you is that there are 500,000 Syrians that were killed during the Assad regime. 300,000 in Ethiopia have been killed in the last several years in a genocide. 400,000 Darfurians in Sudan. The Tigrayans, as I just said, are from Ethiopia. There's 1 million Uyghurs in China, 1 million. They're Muslims. They're ethnic Muslims in China that have been forced sterilized, murdered, forced abortions, put in concentration camps. 1 million people, not 65,000, 1 million. Has anyone walked into a Chinese restaurant in the United States and screamed, shame, shame, shame? Does anyone deface anything? Do they attack Chinese Americans and blame Chinese Americans for the 1 million Uyghurs that have been subjected to forced sterilization and genocide in China? The fact that we are ignoring 6 million Congolese who were killed. Nobody even knows this. Why isn't the press talking about any of this? So the fact that the world's entire focus is on a genocide, which is not a genocide because Israel's engaged in a war, and we can talk about that more, about the distinctions, but that we're hearing nothing about actual genocides with much larger numbers. We hear nothing. There can only be one reason, because the perpetrators of this alleged crime are Jews.
100%. I think that it's foolish to even try to explain in using logic or any type of balance of why is this more important than that. I think we all know that, no Jews, no news is a phrase that you hear all the time. And I think that even non-Jews know that that's true. When you talk about the 33 groups, it's interesting because Harvard is my alma mater, and I'm very active there. I'm on the board of Hillel. I'm was one of the founders of the Harvard Jewish Alumni Alliance, and I organized a very large conference last year, which was sold out, over 1,000 people. And there, I recently was speaking with a very senior person in Harvard's leadership, a dean with a nice corner office. And I said to her, this is, we're still hearing calls that Jews are committing genocide at Harvard's campus. We're still hearing these things that are obvious lies. And we need to try to get that out of the classroom and out of, and come up with some approach to that. She's like, well, it's really just ignorance. It's nothing, it has no motive. And I wonder what you think about that, because I pushed back pretty hard on that. I don't really think that we're dealing with people who are simply ignorant and it's a matter of being influenced by the front page of the New York Times running a false, fabricated picture of a sick child who they're saying is starved when his mother is healthy, his brother's healthy, right in the same camera capture. So I don't think it's just a matter of people being tricked. I think there's something more there, and I think you think there's something more there. But I guess the question is, how do we get people who perhaps understand that at some level to fully own that and to publicly condemn it and to take some action on it? Just as one example, what about in academia, where college after college after college still has courses where they teach that a genocide is happening in Gaza right now? How does one approach that? How do you counteract that?
Well, given your involvement with Harvard as an alumnus and as a post-alumnus in your area as a Jewish person who's concerned about what's happened on their campus. I'm troubled to hear you say that you spoke to someone who used the word casually. Well, I think we should just chalk it up to ignorance. Why would anyone involved with Harvard ever use the word ignorance? Right? Like, to me, that person should be so embarrassed.
Sarah Horn has a great line saying, wow, if only there were some way that you had to educate people.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, as if to say, how could you have a Harvard degree and be so casual about ignorance? You should be saying, I have a Harvard degree. If we're saying things here, they have to be objective truths. We have to get things right. This is not about our feelings or our wish list. What is it? What is it called? The rabbi already said, a lot of it has to do with the word distortion, right? Where words don't mean what they're supposed to mean. And if we shout them loud enough, they become true, which is really what's happened. If you scream genocide enough, people go, well, it must be a genocide because they're screaming the word genocide. They're screaming the word genocide because they don't want to talk about gang raping teenagers or beheading babies, right? So they just scream genocide because they don't want to talk about what actually happened on October 7th and why Israel received this extraordinary, act of aggression that was a declaration of war in a way that most countries wouldn't tolerate for a second. And so they're clearly engaged in a just war and they're fighting it justly. The way to counteract that is just scream the word genocide. And I said, it's the casualness, and I think the rabbi's right about the sort of the word distortions, apartheid. There's been, it's been with respect to Israel, it's been one after another. The word occupation is wrong. It's not an occupation. It was never an occupation. The word apartheid is wrong because there's no separation in Israel. That's what apartheid means, racial separation, right? Well, there's no racial separation when Arabs and Jews and Ethiopians are in the same bus, in the same restaurant, watching the same concert, participating in the same Knesset legislature. That is not apartheid, right? When an Ethiopian Israeli is crowned Miss Israel, that is not an apartheid. So we've allowed this word to be used when it's such an insult to South Africa to actually use the word, or ethnic cleansing, the various words, genocide. Genocide is never used in the context of war. In fact, even the International Court of Justice through the United Nations, even in genocides that people in my position would say were genocides, like Bosnia and Herzegovina or Rwanda, very often, certainly in the Serbian war, the International Court of Justice literally said, other than Srebrenica, these were war crimes. And war crimes are something very, very different from genocide. The reality is genocide is, under the definition, that is a convention, meaning, as you know as a lawyer, signed by countries in 1947 that agreed in this Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide that we would define genocide as the specific intent to destroy a people or a race or a nationality in whole or in part. But if you're engaged in a war, and people are being killed, it doesn't matter how many are being killed. That's not a genocide. If civilians are being killed, it's called collateral damages. They are collateral casualties of war. Why is it called collateral damage? Because the death is collateral to the main aim. The main aim is a war. So if you're in a war, it can't be a genocide. And in no instance in world history, since the actual definition of the word genocide in 1944, since we actually created the crime, in no other instance has the word genocide been used when a nation is at war. Only one time here with Israel. So again, that's why I said, I think if you're an international lawyer, you're either a clown, I'm sorry to your friends, but I've just called them a clown or an anti-Semite, because you're a liar. You know.
I
That's
will
why
let
when
Yossi
Omar
know.
Bartov, that clown from Brown, who wrote that op-ed He knows, to him, it's a career move. He's not a real, he said, I'm a scholar. He's not a scholar because he knows that if you're in a war, the casualty counts are casualties of war. They are collateral damage. Genocide is a specific intent. If Israel had a specific intent to wipe out the Palestinian people, they would have done it by now. They would not be giving warnings, precautionary warnings of where the next operation is being conducted. They would not be providing avenues for aid. They would not be creating international humanitarian zones. Here's something they wouldn't do. They would not implement ground forces into Gaza, because by putting in ground forces, if you have such a good Israeli Air Force, you could have wiped out Gaza in a few days. We saw what Israel could do in Iran. If they were trying to commit genocide, they're terrible at it because they could have done this more. They've gone to every precautionary level to spare civilian life. So when you see people like Omar Bartov, a clown, or any of these other people that say, I am an academic, that's a joke. They have a university affiliation. They're not an academic because if they're using the word genocide, they're distorting a meaning. They've invented a new crime that does not exist. What's that crime? They're now saying that if too many civilians are killed, even in a war, it's a genocide. And I'm saying, you know what? That is a very dangerous thing to say because no other country that signed that convention thinks that that will apply to them. And no country will want to know that when we go to war with another country, and no matter what they did to us to justify our war, if any civilians are killed, we will be condemned as committing genocide. No other country is going to want that. And this is very dangerous. That's why I'm saying they're clowns. They're playing with fire. When you're in a war, you're in a war. You're not committing a genocide. The damages, the collateral damages, are collateral to the main objective, which is to win a war. And let's remember, how did this war begin? Nobody wants to talk about it. 6,000 people invaded Israel. 2,000 of the 6,000 were civilians. So when we talk about civilian casualties, they're not innocent civilians. A third of the people that invaded were themselves civilians who were gang raping, who were beheading and burning. They were participants, full participants. You had rocket fire. You had complicity from the civilian population. You had promises from Hamas leaders that they would do it again and again and again. The hostages were never returned. The Red Cross was never permitted to see the hostages. No one has ever surrendered or laid down any weapons. I am telling you as an honest law professor, not a clown, and an actual law professor, not a clown. I'm saying to you, Israel can do whatever it needs to do in this war as long as it fits the category of a military necessity. And if civilians are killed, those are casualties of war. The judgment under international law and under the laws of armed conflict are what are you aiming at, and does it have substantial military significance? What are you aiming at, and what is it? And most people don't realize they don't fire drones in Israel or rocket fire or jets firing missiles without lawyers standing next to heads of the IDF looking at the facility and saying, is this a military necessity and will it satisfy the rules of proportionality? Now, Hamas doesn't.
Well, do you think that they should be operating that way?
Israelis don't do this. Israelis take a very critical look at every bullet they fire.
Do you think that Israel should be operating that way? I mean, you spoke about so many things. One of the things that you keep bringing up is this sort of inversion of language where we have terms that are being used by those who actually are committed to committing genocide, who actually do have an apartheid state, where they're contemplating this new Palestine that they're looking to create would have zero Jews in it, right? That's one of the requirements. And they're inverting language. And I guess our psychologist, Rabbi, could help us maybe understand this projection that is being done.
Well,
Also, do you think in your book you talk a lot about what the laws are? How do you think Israel should behave in that situation? What is a just nation that does care about the law, a law-abiding international citizen, if you will, to do in a case where you have this asymmetrical warfare?
Well, that's why the charges against Israel are so baseless, because it's not clear to me whether it's even required to follow the laws of armed conflict. They're not fighting a state actor. They're fighting terrorists. The nature of the war itself, what I just said to you, rolled out those charges. That's what happened on October 7th. That requires a substantial response. That deserves a substantial response, morally and legally and militarily. They're fighting terrorists that are not observing any of the laws of war, any of the laws of international humanitarian law. They're taking hostages, that violates the Geneva Convention, and they're using human shields, which violates every possible law that you can possibly imagine. So the question is holding Israel to a standard of purity, of doctrinal purity, and holding Hamas according to no standard. So you're seeing the absurdity of Israel's being charged with genocide in the International Court of Justice. Its leaders are being given subpoenas for the International Criminal Court. Nobody wants to talk about Hamas's crimes, right? They're not interested in that. So Israel's absolutely observing the laws of war. Hamas is ignoring every single tenet, including the worst of the worst, taking hostages and using human shields. And yet no one wants to talk about that. So one of the reasons I named the book Beyond Proportionality is because most wars actually go beyond proportionality. That's what happened in the Civil War. I like to say that Abraham Lincoln would have been a Zionist, and Abraham Lincoln would have looked at this war and would have said, you go, Israel, and don't stop. Don't listen to the anti-Semites. You go, stop. Don't stop. That's what I did in the Civil War. I told my general Tecumseh Sherman, burn the city of Atlanta and burn the food. Burn the food. This is Abraham Lincoln. Burn the food. Make the South suffer to get them to surrender, right? The bombings of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Dresden were not military in nature, had minimal military. So if you want to say genocide, now you're going to have to say that Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman had committed genocide. So I said to the clowns out there that use these words so loosely, be careful the way you use your words, because now you have to look at all these other wars and say, wait a minute, you killed tens of thousands of civilians? You're not allowed to do, you can't kill civilians. And let me tell you something about we don't know, unlike the Hamas, unlike the Gazans that support Hamas, we don't know for sure exactly what the people of Dresden at that time believed, right? But we bombed them anyway, right? And so again, those wars went beyond proportionality in order to be brought to an end. And what's happened here is the world won't let Israel finish the job. This is again and again and again. Joe Biden tripped over himself endlessly. You know, everything was restraint. We heard this with President Obama. The words restraint, de-escalate. These are words that only apply to Jews. Restraint and de-escalate only, they don't apply to any other army. When we fought the American coalition forces against ISIS in Mosul, right? We killed 12,000 civilians. No one used the word restraint or de-escalate. Nobody used the word genocide. It's only seemingly applied in this case when we're dealing with terrorists and complicit civilians. And one last thing I want to say about complicit civilians that I mentioned in the book that is a very important point. We now know that of last September, when Israel had the war had turned, and all of a sudden, Israel, largely because Joe Biden stopped lecturing Israel about what it could do, And so the world war turned, and Israel turned to Hezbollah to finally put an end to them. That was the beepers and the walkie-talkies. When Israel, after that, went after Nasrallah and killed their leadership and pretty much disabled all of their military operations. You know what we didn't hear about? Lebanese civilians. What happened to them? How come there wasn't genocide there? You want to know why? They left Beirut, the suburbs, Dahia, the suburb of Beirut, where all the weapons are usually launched by Hezbollah. They got out. They're not insane like the Gazans. They can take a hint. I don't want my children killed. I don't want to be killed. Israel is going to be attacking. We're going north. We are not going to be here. So it's interesting that it's like, it's only the Palestinians. It's because they don't leave. There is a civilian death strategy, which Hamas has perfected, and the Gazans have been complicit in allowing. People forget, Israel will tell you that 50% of whatever the deaths are all terrorists, and 30% additional are the friends and family of the terrorists. So now we're at 80%, right? That's what this is really about. And if you add to that teenage fighters from Gaza, I'm not really sure. Like, for instance, with starvation, we know there's only under 30 people that we know have died of starvation in Gaza. And yet we hear the words of mass starvation, and we only know of under 30, and there are very few of them that are children. So we're being told this is children, women and children. But as I said, teenage fighters, I talk about this in the book, I know of no moral principle that their lives are more valuable than a 19-year-old Israeli.
Yeah, I want to move on to the discussion of protected speech in America, specifically relating to Zara Mamdani, who refuses to condemn the term globalize the Intifada. What's your opinion about that? From my perspective, the reason he doesn't want to condemn the term is because he wants to globalize the Intifada. And that term seems to me to be a terminology of real genocide against the Jews. What's your opinion on that?
Well, Rabbi, my last book was Saving Free Speech from Itself. It was a book on the First Amendment. So you're talking to the right guy. I wrote a book about the laws of war, dealing with asymmetric warfare in Gaza. And then before that, I wrote a book on free speech. And what I can tell you, again, I can't explain it other than anti-Semitism. Where are the First Amendment scholars? Where are they? Because they know what I'm about to tell you. But where are they? There is no First Amendment free speech guarantees or protections for something called true threats. It's under Virginia versus Black. It's a Supreme Court case. There are no free speech protections, safeguards, for what's called fighting words. That's Shaplinsky versus New Hampshire. There are no free speech protections even for group libel under Beauharnais versus Illinois. There is no free speech protections for incitement of imminent violence. That's under Brandenburg versus Ohio. Those are 4 Supreme Court law cases. Now, what I can tell you is that those cases would not protect me if I went to campus and screamed, lynch blacks, lynch blacks, lynch blacks. I would not have academic freedom. First of all, I would be kicked out of the university. God knows what would happen to me. But lynch blacks is clearly fighting words, in true threats, intimidation, and incitement. And if I disguised it, which what I'm sure Mamdani will say is, if I said this to you, Rabbi, if I said, well, when I say lynch blacks, I don't mean that. I'm really against racial preferences. That's what I'm really about. I don't like racial preferences. And I choose to express myself with the words lynch blacks, because that's what they're telling you. That's what Mamdani would say. When I say globalize the Intifada, I don't mean Intifada in the killing. I mean, I'm supporting Palestinian rights, and I'm rejecting Israel's war strategy in Gaza. And that's just utterly nonsense. No Muslim and no Islamist who hears the words Intifada is thinking that. He's thinking, or she's thinking, kill Jews. And to globalize the Intifada means to kill Jews wherever you find them. So I don't even understand how this is even a question. I don't understand. I find it shocking that we don't have law professors saying, whoa, 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 whoa. Globalized Intifada there are no First Amendment protections under Virginia versus Black. But why am I alone here? Do I not understand something? Lori's a lawyer as well. We're not hearing this. You're right. The thing that's interesting about Mamdani is he won't even do the political thing to do. He's literally saying, I don't want to censor somebody else's free speech. Instead of saying, I understand what globalized Intifada means. I understand that there's been murders outside the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. There were killings in a mall in Denver. People have been hearing words like globalize the Intifada, and they have been acting on it. They have been fomenting violence against Jews with these words. And so therefore, as the mayor of the largest city in the United States with the most Jews in it, I need to make a statement that globalize the Intifada is absolutely not permitted in my city because it essentially grants a right and an incitement to kill Jews. That's what he should be saying, and that's not what he is saying.
Well, you bring up a couple of questions about intent because, your explanation of why Mamdani shouldn't be allowed to say that. His argument is, well, that's not what I meant. That's right. Not what I meant. But at the same time, Israel's intent is always presumed to be the worst. So
well, as I said to you before,
how do people who have who support Israel, who understand the truth of these issues, what do you suggest for them to do about that?
Well, as
language
I said before,
being corrupted.
Thank you, Lori. Well, as I said before, when you come to the word intent, if you're in a war, your intent is obvious, right? Your intent is to win the war. Your intent is not to eliminate a people. You're aiming at terrorists who happen to be standing next to civilians. You're not aiming at the civilians. You're aiming at the terrorists who happen to be right there. So that intent is clear. And similarly, you can't, if you're the mayor of a large city, you can't leave that so ambiguously to say, well, I don't mean that. He should be saying, I stand for all citizens of my city. And I'm worried. I'm not saying it has nothing to do with my intent. My intent is irrelevant. There are other people out there who are not rational actors. They're bad actors. They're anti-Semites. And I cannot give them an excuse to kill Jews. And as the mayor of a city with the largest Jewish population in the United States, I have a moral and political obligation to make it very clear that words matter. And these words are inciting, they're fighting words, they're true threats. And as Thane Rosenbaum said, they're not protected under the First Amendment. And as I know he didn't go to law school, but he can trust me on this. And he should say, if it's even a close call, I don't want this in my city because I don't want my citizens to be living in fear. And what instead he's saying is, well, I don't feel that way. I don't care what other people feel, as if he has no obligation, and the rabbi should really weigh in on this, to exercise moral leadership. Don't we actually want leaders to not just win political elections, but also to exercise moral leadership, to actually say, I'm the mayor of a city and I have to send a very strong message of what's right and what's not right. And it would not be right to allow the words globalize the Intifada.
Yeah, and it's not just to give him advice how to respond. I'm wondering what you think the role of Jewish leaders and organizations should be now. I mean, they're not saying enough to defend ourselves against his threat right now. What do you think their role should be?
Well, it's just we're living in a very strange time. Jews are much more focused on hating Donald Trump. It's shocking to me. I don't love Donald Trump, but my mind is not on him. I don't spend a lot of time on him. If anything, my only time is to say, thank you, Mr. President, for doing a number of things to protect Jews in the United States and around the world. Thank you. I don't understand how you Jewish American can't say that. I don't like you, President Trump. I didn't vote for you, but thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate what you've done. Today, that is a scam. You'll get kicked out of a Shabbat dinner for saying what I just said. You'd be kicked right out. Instead of saying, no, that's the menschlich thing to do, to say you've gone out of your way to stand up for Israel and to stand up for Jews on campus. Thank you. I don't like the way you conduct yourself. I don't like the way you speak. I don't like this. I don't like, it's fine, but thank you. And where Jews haven't learned this, I don't understand. And why rabbis in Reformed synagogues or Reconstructionist synagogues are unable to say, this is something, because, and the reason for that is because they're so self-hating that they don't think that the decisions that President Trump have made are good. You know, they're against, they reject Israel. They're so interested. I've said this before, you know, Jews are not as smart as they claim. You know, they get into law school and dental school, but that's not so hard to do, right? In my view,
don't tell my mother that.
Jews, well, and you went to Harvard. Jews have very low self-esteem. How do I know this? Because they are afraid to stand up for themselves. They're so interested in sitting at the cool kids table in high school. That's what they're really interested in. I want to be one of the cool kids. What does a cool kid do? Israel's the worst human rights violator in the history of the world, and I'm ashamed to be Jewish. That's what the cool kids say. And I'll say whatever I need to say to get invited to a party in the Hamptons. I will say whatever I need to say to impress my children who went to Ivy League schools and they've been taught, indoctrinated to hate themselves, to hate Israel. I'll say anything. I'm ignorant. I haven't read a book. I don't know what I'm saying. I really have no knowledge about any of this stuff, but I will publicly condemn my people and myself. So I think, unfortunately, the Jewish leadership suffers from very much the same thing. You know, I mean, I left the synagogue that I was in to a different synagogue because I was tired of being told on Yom Kippur that Jews are racists. I was tired about hearing words like ethnic cleansing. I was tired of hearing words like this. But this is very common among not just Jewish Americans, but Jewish leaders and far too many rabbis. And as you know, in the Reform movement, you know, it is very much a criticize Israel first agenda, that the first thing to do is let's get something out of the way. Israel is at fault. Let's just say, let me say that, and that way people will like me and I'll come across as enlightened and humanistic, instead of saying, yeah, but you're lying and you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're saying. And you have endangered your people. You know, the sentence that begins with speaking as a Jew, comma, this sentence should be outlawed by Jews. They should not be allowed to say the words speaking as a Jew, comma, because we know what comes after that. I am disgusted by what's happened in Gaza. I'm disgusted about what Netanyahu is doing in conducting this war. This is all too common that we see, not just among Jewish students, but I would say rabbis, Jewish secular leaders, legacy leaders. And let me just say, they're only now starting to see the damage that was caused, because they're starting to turn around saying, oh my God, we made a big mistake. We don't have allies. Our allies have turned against us. We thought we would get a lot more credit for standing behind Black Lives Matter and Me Too. We haven't. The evidence was there that the progressive agenda had a very anti-Israel sensibility, and we ignored it to our peril. And so Jews have put themselves in this position largely because they waited and watched this happen. And it reached a critical mass to where we are now, and it's very hard to overturn it now.
I do want to just push back a little bit on that, because I think, you know, I understand what you're saying about different movements having different points of view. And it's possible that on a broad strokes may be true. But some of the best, most pro-Israel rabbis out there are affiliated with the Reform movement. And for that matter, Peter Beinart, who is one of the absolute worst about Israel, the most as a Jew, getting his fame and fortune based on his horrible views is affiliates as Orthodox. So I don't want to say that one movement or another is to blame. I think that really what you have is Jewish people of many backgrounds who feel proud of themselves and their Judaism and of Israel, versus those who are confused, who, like you said, want to be cool kids or want to be popular or just afraid of coming out and saying what they really believe. And I think it can be any movement. I just wanted to.
All I would say, I agree with that. I'm sure you're right. I look at this as a crisis time in Jewish history. And so I'm not quarreling over small things because the issues are too big. Yes, some of the things I say, you could say, yes, but that's not everybody. Of course, I don't mean everybody.
No.
I'm just saying the crisis is so large at this point that I'm not going to do what everyone else is doing. I'm not going to go, who's to say, who's to know? Everyone has their own opinion. I'm telling you exactly, we are in a crisis point, and I am not here to debate nuance. I'm here to say we've got some serious dangers ahead for the Jewish people. And as far as the Reform movement, Rick Jacobs, who is the leader of the Reform movement, is no friend of Jews. I'm sorry. He's no friend of Israel. He's no friend of Jews. And I hope he hears this. So, I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to speak truths. Okay. And we're not hearing enough truth telling in our society. And I'm happy to play that role, even though, unlike Peter Beinart, my career path is not nearly as smart as his. If you want a good career path as a writer and a public intellectual, follow Peter Beinart. Don't follow Thane Rosenbaum.
Yeah, let me ask you a question about that, because I read online that your parents were both Holocaust survivors. And I'm just wondering, how much is that influencing how you think about issues, how you perceive what's going on with a guy like Zohar Mamdani, as you see the Democratic Party going so far left, embracing anti-Semitism openly? How has that affected your life and your career?
Rabbi, I care what you think, not what I think on this, because you're not only a rabbi that has, strong feelings in the psychological universe, but you run a podcast that has the words Viktor Frankl in it. So, you give this kind of thinking a lot more thought than I do. I've written 5 novels that have post-Holocaust themes. I've written a lot about the Holocaust as a nonfiction and as a fiction writer. I know a lot about it. I studied it. My parents never spoke about it. So their lives are very much a mystery. I think they would be shocked. They died when I was very young. I think they would be shocked that you and I are having this conversation right now. They would say, we never mentioned the word. It never came up. Where do you get this stuff? Yes, we were in death camps. Yes, you would learn about it later. But, why is a rabbi asking you whether what you've chosen to write and say is informed by that? Where does he get off saying that? Well, it's a legitimate question, but I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer, because I would not say that I grew up in a home that it was obsessed with Holocaust memory. I would say I grew up in a home that was interested in Holocaust amnesia. And I think my parents wanted more from me out of my life than to have this follow me around. And so I don't know, I can't speak to it. I've been asked for 30 years since my first collection of short stories, but I don't really know the answer. I don't know. Friends of mine have always speculated. I look at this and say, I don't think this has anything to do with the Holocaust. This goes much deeper, in the sense that this has been a problem throughout Jewish history. It did not begin with the Holocaust. It culminated in something that ended up with the return of the nation state of Israel. But when you see what happened on October 7th, that Holocaust memory and the creation of the nation state of Israel was no inoculant. Schindler's List was no inoculant. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., no inoculant, no immunity. If October 7th can happen, and people are walking around and saying, well, the Jews might deserve it, any means necessary. Look, after all, they stole the land, Jews are white privileged people. When you start to hear people trivialize what's happened or stand by and watch attacks against Jews in Toronto and Stockholm and Copenhagen and Madrid and Paris, I've traveled this country telling people about what has happened to Parisian Jews since 2005 with the torturing of Ilan Halimi. They look at me like I'm insane. Jewish Americans didn't know anything about this. They were interested in renovating their kitchens, getting a second house in Aspen. This is what Jews in America were doing. They had no idea what was happening to Jews. What I say is the minute we started to hear death to Israel, death to America in Dearborn, Michigan, and other cities around the country, Jews in Europe looked at us and said, welcome to the world. Welcome to the world that we understand. And what I'm saying is, if you thought that the Holocaust and its aftermath would have resulted in an inoculant, there are still survivors alive. How is that even possible? That people are actually using words about killing Jews, globalize the Intifada with living Holocaust survivors? You'd think you would have waited another 200 years before that. That's how little of protection it was for global Jewry.
And it seems to be, so Holocaust memorials don't work. It only seems to be the only option we have is to start speaking out, speaking loudly, and speaking with tremendous clarity, as you seem to be doing. So we very much appreciate the words that you've been using.
Thank you.
Your insights are so remarkable, Professor. I've rarely seen such clarity in the media. I wish American media would hear a lot more of you and about you as well.
Rabbi, they don't want to hear from me. I mean, when people ask me about that, I say, look, I've not refused major media. I mean, I'm a contributor for Newsmax. I used to do analysis for the major cable news shows, but now, look, what I have to say is the wrong messaging. It's just simply not what people want to hear. And again, this has a lot to do with the infiltration of what was happening on campuses. People like me even I was paying attention, but was very naive. I assumed, yes, this was happening on campuses, the merger of post-Marxism and Islamism and anti-colonialism. Those three things, the intersections between Marxist theory, anti-colonialism, and Islamist thinking that was being funded by Qatar in American universities, created a perfect storm in the university, perfect storm. And it's not just what Lori said earlier. I'm glad I just remembered when she said what's being taught. It's not just what's being taught, it's what's not being taught. So for instance, she went to Harvard. How is it possible at Harvard University that you cannot show me, maybe this year will be different, but for the last 10 years, you cannot show me any syllabus in any class with a pro-Israel article. Not only is it anti-Israel, you don't even get any other perspective. Not only was there a pro-Zionist course you could take, not only, forget the course, there wasn't a reading assignment, not one. I still defy Harvard to show me a syllabus where one reading was something like that I wrote or some other pro-Israel thinker. Not one. How is that possible at Harvard University? So when they received the last place ratings by Fire in free speech and viewpoint diversity, that's the reason, that they wouldn't even let an article in. But what I didn't understand, I didn't appreciate fully, was that when these people graduated from this indoctrination academies, anti-Israel, anti-American, anti-white, anti-Zionist, that they would then go to the New York Times, they would go to other universities, they would go to museums, they would go to publishing houses, and that over a period of time, at this point, this is, as I said, a critical mass, the way they were taught has infiltrated the way we hear ideas. The way ideas are disseminated are through major media, book publishing, cable television. they were all infiltrated by people that were taught that Jews were evil, that Israel was a genocidal, apartheid, ethnic cleansing state. And they believed this stuff. For people who are natural anti-Semites, this was perfect. And for people that were unnatural anti-Semites, they were told this was truth. And they were told by professors with PhDs. And so that's what we're up against. We're up against the sources of knowledge, like the universities, like the mass media, like book publishing, like museums, have all been infected by this cancer, this virus of Jew hate. And Jews have not, as you're right, Rabbi, have simply not stood up for themselves. They just have not. They trip over themselves to get in line to pump their fists for Black Lives Matter. They are the first ones out there. The Women's March, the 2 of the 4 founders were Jewish women. People don't remember the story. Lori, I'm sure, knows this. 2 of the 4 founders of the Women's March were Jews. And after the successful march, the 2 other women basically said to them, from now on, you keep your mouth shut because your people
Linda
were
Sarsour, correct? Linda Sarsour,
in the slave trade.
Yeah.
In the slave trade. Right, Linda Sarsour. And the 2 Jewish women looked at each other like, what? Slave trade? Jews we're the ones responsible for the slave trade. So they left the movement. So Jews were always heading up these progressive movements, assuming they were building allyship, and they were not. And now we're left without allies, and we don't know what to say. And that's why I appreciate what Lori said, because the book was written in many ways for regular people, civilians, to read the book and say, I now have a much deeper understanding of what Israel is doing and why no, they're not violating any laws, and I know how to respond. But Jews have been cowed. They've been afraid to defend themselves and the Jewish state. And it's very difficult to watch from the bleachers. And that's where I am.
Well, hopefully hearing you and hearing this program will give people a little shot of courage and a little more chutzpah to stand up to those who they have to know have none of their interest at heart.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for opening up this forum for me and the new book. And, you're among the righteous, if it means anything to you, because I travel widely and I see what the other side looks like. And we need more people like you, true crusaders. So thank you.
Same to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.